He thought it was just another layer of rock deep inside the mountain. But when the drilling machine hit a hidden metal wall, the entire project was shut down. Going down to investigate, he became the first to see what had been secretly buried underground for decades. Subscribe to the channel and comment which country you're watching from. Michael Johnson had always been the kind of man who worked with quiet determination, the sort of person who believed that if he kept his head down, did his job well, and pushed forward no matter how heavy the burden felt on his shoulders, life would eventually reward him. He had never been one to expect miracles, but he had always held on to the belief that honest work had value, and that someday that value would return to him when he needed it most. Now, with his little boy's life depending on treatment that grew more expensive each month, he clung to that belief like a lifeline. His son, Caleb, had been born with a rare immune disorder that turned every common cold into a potential medical emergency. Every hospital visit drained not only their savings, but their hope, piece by fragile piece. Michael worked overtime whenever he could, and his wife Sandra juggled 2 jobs while still trying to keep a warm home and a brave smile for their child. They lived day to day, bill to bill, always chasing the next paycheck in hopes it would be enough. And then came this project, this enormous government-funded construction job that promised bonuses and the possibility of a promotion he had been chasing for years. The announcement had felt like divine intervention. He was a lead tunneling operator now, part of a highly skilled crew chosen to cut a new industrial passageway deep beneath the mountains. Engineers claimed this tunnel would not only shorten transport routes for essential goods across the region, but also boost national infrastructure in ways the public would celebrate. For Michael, it meant something simpler and far more personal. It meant keeping Caleb alive. He had been proud when he first walked onto the site months ago, taking in the scale of the machinery, the towering cranes, the endless convoys of trucks. This wasn't a patch job or a small-town contract. This was the kind of project that made careers. His supervisor had even hinted that if things continued smoothly and productivity remained high, upper management would consider promoting him into project oversight. That would mean a steady increase in income, health insurance upgrades, and a future that didn't feel like a narrowing hallway. The mountains around them were stunning. In the early mornings, before the heavy machinery roared to life and drowned out nature's silence, mist clung to the jagged cliffs like a shroud. Pine trees dotted the slopes and swayed under the chill winds rolling down from snow-capped peaks. But beneath the beauty lay hostility. Every worker understood that mountains did not like to be carved open. They pushed back with falling rock, structural instability, and unseen weaknesses that could turn a normal shift into disaster without warning. Michael knew these dangers better than most. He had worked in mines as a much younger man, had dug through the earth long before proper training and safety protocols were standard. That was how he had earned his scars and his respect. The roar and vibration of the drilling machines during the day became a constant rhythm he could feel in his bones. The giant tunnel-boring equipment was powerful enough to chew through thick stone as if it were brittle clay. It required careful calculation and precision, though, because one wrong angle could send tons of rock crashing down. There were regulations, inspections, hazard briefings, yet everyone lived with the knowledge that one mistake or one miscalculation from someone far above their pay grade could kill them instantly. But Michael had always thrived under pressure. Supervisors knew they could trust him with the tougher sections of excavation. He never cut corners and never asked others to take risks he wouldn't take himself. On the morning that changed everything, he had already been uneasy without knowing why. It wasn't unusual to feel dread on days when they drilled deeper into untouched geological formations, but this felt different. His instincts were restless, whispering that the mountain held secrets it did not want disturbed. He kissed Caleb's photo in his wallet before storing it in his locker, as he always did before a shift that involved significant tunneling depth. A simple ritual, but it helped him feel grounded. He reminded himself why he was fighting so hard, why he was willing to go underground day after day into a darkness most people would panic in. For his son, he would crawl into hell itself. His team gathered around the massive boring machine as it rumbled and clanked into place. The noise echoed sharply through the cavern, as though the mountain itself wanted to announce its displeasure. The drill bit, lined with diamond-tipped cutters, spun faster and faster until it blurred. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Michael took his usual post, monitoring pressure output and vibration readings. The numbers were normal, consistent with their projections. They were carving deeper than ever before into this segment, and the engineers were optimistic about making record progress. Then, without warning, the machine lurched as if it had struck something immovable. The grinding sound stopped. Every alarm on Michael's control panel erupted into flashing lights. A jarring metallic clang echoed through the tunnel, followed by silence so complete and unnatural that the hair on Michael's arms rose. Workers looked at one another, confusion and fear flickering in their eyes. Machines didn't just stop like that. They slowed, they jammed, they stalled, but they did not slam into a dead halt with such violent finality unless something massive was blocking their path. Something that shouldn't have been there. Michael shouted orders, his voice commanding despite the tension gripping his throat. He checked data, but the equipment provided no answers. The drill head had hit a barrier at an angle where there should have been nothing but solid mountain. No faults, no underground caverns, not according to the geological surveys. Engineers pored over plans, cursing under their breath. They knew the stakes. Delays meant millions lost. Delays meant questions. Delays meant bureaucrats breathing down their necks. But none of that mattered if the machine was compromised or if the rock face had become unstable. Loose dirt and fragments of stone trickled from the ceiling. Workers backed away from the drilling face, expecting aftershocks. Michael approached cautiously with portable scanners, tracking for voids or unexpected structural elements. His pulse hammered as he noticed the strange readings. Instead of jagged rock returning irregular signals, he saw a perfectly straight reflective surface beneath the damaged section of stone. It was flat. It was cold. And it should never have existed there. One of the foremen turned to Michael, eyes wide with an uncertainty he rarely revealed. Someone had to assess this up close. Someone trained to spot weaknesses in tunnels. Someone who knew how to navigate confined spaces if things went wrong. They needed answers to report to headquarters. They needed a pair of steady hands and a clear mind. They needed Michael. He didn't hesitate outwardly. He secured his harness, strapped on protective gear, and clipped a safety line to the anchor point. Inside, however, an unease curled deeper into his thoughts. Mountains did not hide human-made shapes. Nature did not create straight corners and smooth walls. Before he descended, he glanced around at his crew. He saw fear masked by professionalism, men and women who all quietly prayed he would return with a logical explanation. He swallowed his concern, gave them a reassuring nod, and activated his headlamp. With one final deep breath, he slipped down into the opening where the rock had broken away. He lowered himself carefully through a narrow chute of fractured stone. his boots tapping against surfaces that quickly transitioned from rough to disturbingly smooth. The beam of his light glided across a surface that gleamed dully in the dust-filled air. Cold metal, buried deep underground where no metal should be. The darkness below him opened into a space with geometry far too perfect and intentional to be natural. His last thought before both of his feet found purchase on that impossible structure was that the promise of this job, the future it held for his son, the reward he prayed for, had just collided with something silent and hidden beneath the earth for a very long time. Something that was never meant to be found. Michael steadied himself, his breath echoing faintly off distant unseen walls. He radioed to the surface, voice calm in contrast to the storm rising in his mind. Whatever they had struck, it wasn't rock. It was a door into the unknown. And, as his fingers brushed the cold metallic surface beneath centuries of silence, a single realization cut through the uncertainty like a blade. This discovery would change everything. For his job, for his family, for everyone on that mountain. The project that was supposed to save his son might have just opened the way to something that could cost far more than money. Michael pointed his light into the dark, bracing himself for what waited beyond the reach of its narrow beam. Whatever lay inside this mountain had been sealed away by design. And he had just become the first man to disturb that secret. The cold beneath the mountain felt different from the cold of natural caverns. Natural cold breathed and shifted, born of drafts through cracks in rock and vents where Earth's hidden air escaped, but this chill was stagnant and metallic, a sterile vacuum of sensation that told Michael he had crossed a boundary. Above him was rock, machinery, a world governed by natural forces and predictable equations. Down here, someone had made choices. Someone had shaped this place by will, not geology. His boots pressed against the smooth metal surface as he inhaled slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim radius of his headlamp. The beam stretched ahead and then fell away into darkness. The edges of his light traced clean angles, walls that rose dead straight, a floor without cracks, all coated in a thin layer of dust that softened the perfection. Years of abandonment had settled over this place, like the residue of a secret kept too long. He pressed a gloved hand against the wall. The metal was cold, so cold that it bit through fabric and into his skin as if it wanted to warn him away. It wasn't a temperature that made sense this far underground, not unless there was an active cooling system or some technology he didn't yet understand. The surface was seamless, with no bolts or visible welds. Even the corners where the walls met the ceiling seemed molded, as if the structure had been cast from a single piece. His radio crackled, breaking the silence. The sound startled him more than he cared to admit. "Johnson, report. What do you see down there?" He hesitated, trying to translate what he was witnessing into words that didn't sound insane. "It's not rock," he finally said. "Metal, perfectly straight surfaces. This is built, manufactured. Doesn't look abandoned for decades. It looks untouched, sealed." There was a long pause before the voice responded again, strained and forcefully neutral. "Proceed with caution." Proceed with caution. Easy for them to say from the safety of the tunnel floor above. Michael pictured Sandra reading to Caleb in their cramped living room, his son clutching his inhaler like a lifeline. He had come here to dig a tunnel, to earn money, not to step into nightmares buried under mountains. But turning back now wasn't an option. They needed answers, and someone had to lead the way. He had always been that someone. He stepped forward and immediately noticed something odd beneath his feet. The layer of dust gave way to a pattern, faint grooves that traced long, parallel lines. Tracks. Like rails, but much more precise. He crouched, running his fingers along them, imagining machines rolling through this place at speeds the old mining carts he once worked with could never dream of. As he followed the tracks, he noticed a faint glint farther ahead. His light illuminated a vertical structure built into the wall, a door, but not a door like the crude steel blast doors used in old bunkers. This was precise, immaculate, carved into the wall without so much as a hinge visible. There was a panel beside it with buttons arranged in a pattern that made no sense to him. No numbers, no letters, only symbols he did not recognize. He reached for the panel without thinking, then stopped himself, pulse hammering. Touching unknown machinery underground was how people died in cautionary tales. He lowered his hand and instead examined the door more closely. Dust accumulated in subtle lines where the door separated from the wall, confirming that it did indeed open. It was not decorative. It was an entrance. What was behind it? He turned away, only to spot something else in the periphery. Stairs descending in a tight square coil, each step smooth and evenly spaced. The staircase bent downward out of sight, suggesting additional floors. How deep did this go? The idea that someone had constructed a multi-level complex this far inside a mountain was staggering. To hide it so perfectly from all geological surveys meant planning, power, secrecy on a scale that did not belong to any legitimate corporate project. "Johnson, talk to me," came the radio again, the voice tighter now. "Are you alone down there? Any signs of instability?" Michael swallowed. "There's more than one level. Doors, stairs. This isn't some collapsed mine. It's a facility." "A facility?" The word hung in the air, too big and too heavy. "Are you certain?" "I'm standing in it," he replied. A long silence, filled only by the faint hum of electric equipment on the surface, equipment that suddenly felt trivial and primitive compared to what surrounded him. He imagined his colleagues listening, staring down into the opening he had slipped through, trying to picture what he was seeing. Then a calmer voice took over the line. Corporate tone, controlled. "Continue your survey. Document everything. Do not attempt to open doors or interact with unfamiliar systems. We're notifying the appropriate authorities." Authorities. That word sent a ripple of unease down Michael's spine. Not project supervisors, not engineers, not structural analysts. Authorities. Whoever built this place was important enough, dangerous enough, that the company did not want to claim responsibility. He clicked off the radio. The silence returned, absolute. Even his own breathing felt loud, amplified by walls engineered to reflect sound efficiently. He walked slowly, letting his flashlight guide each step. He saw no debris, no personal items, no signs of chaos. Everything looked as if the last occupants had set tools down neatly and walked away expecting to return before the day ended. He found another corridor branching off, lined with doors identical to the first. No windows, no markings, just quiet tension built into every line of their construction. He crouched again, tracing another track with his fingers, trying to imagine what kind of machines had been moved here. None of it belonged to any period he recognized. It was too modern, yet too forgotten. He inhaled deeply. The air carried a hint of antiseptic, faint but unmistakable. Sterility meant purpose. Sterility meant human activity, not the kind that welcomed disclosures or inspections. Underground labs, black sites, secret research. The thoughts scared him because they felt plausible. As he stood and turned back toward the main chamber where he had descended, his light swept over a stretch of wall and caught something he had missed before. A small, circular indentation near the baseboard. He stepped closer. It looked like a ventilation port, but not one designed for airflow from natural caverns. The edges were razor clean, machine perfect. Ventilation meant life support. This place wasn't meant to be sealed forever. It had been designed to house people, many people. A faint tremor passed through the metal beneath his feet, so subtle he might have imagined it. But the vibration triggered a memory. Back in the mine shafts, trapped gas shifting behind barriers, warning miners to evacuate before explosions. Here, though, there was no rock. So what was shifting? His hand rose to his chest as a wave of realization crept over him. This place may not be entirely dead. The thought lodged in his brain like a splinter. He turned again, slowly, scanning every shadow for movement he knew logic told him shouldn't exist. And yet, logic had stopped applying the moment he touched metal where rock should have been. He forced himself onward, documenting with his camera, speaking his observations aloud into the radio now and then, so the recording would capture every detail. But each new step revealed only more questions, more signs that something highly classified had been hidden away where no citizen would ever stumble across it. Not until now. He found a small alcove where dust was disturbed, patterns indicating that perhaps equipment had been moved not decades ago, but mere years, maybe even months. A knot formed in his stomach, tightening with every new clue. The complex was dormant, not abandoned. Waiting. Eventually, after what might have been an hour or a lifetime in the suffocating stillness, he returned to the opening where he had come down. He craned his neck and saw the faint glow of work lights above, the silhouettes of worried faces leaning in, hoping for answers he did not have. He radioed up again. "I need to come back up. There's a lot we're not prepared for here." The line was quiet for a moment before his supervisor replied in a voice that suggested he was no longer fully in charge of the situation. "Copy that. Stand by for retrieval." As Michael waited for the harness to descend, he glanced once more into the dark corridors behind him. The atmosphere seemed to shift. Something that had been asleep sensed intrusion. Perhaps it was only his imagination or the latent weight of fear finally descending upon him, but the feeling was too sharp to ignore. He was no longer just a tunneling operator. Not in this place. The harness hook clanged against the metal at his feet, snapping his attention upward. He clipped in and signaled. As he rose away from the impossible floor, he kept his light pointed downward, watching the metal swallow the last of the artificial light into a silence that felt like a warning. When he reached the breach and climbed out onto familiar rock once more, the air felt different, warmer, louder, alive. He had crossed worlds. Unlike any other shift in his life, he couldn't dust his hands and move on. Someone had built a secret beneath the mountain. Someone had gone to enormous lengths to erase it from history, and now that he had found it, he knew that discovery would not be celebrated. As the opening was sealed for safety and workers whispered nervously among themselves, Michael forced his features into a mask of calm. Yet his pulse raced. He wasn't sure if he should tell them everything he'd seen. Fear told him to keep quiet. Conscience told him to speak up. In the end, he said only enough to confirm one terrible truth. "There's a structure down there, not abandoned long enough to be forgotten. Not something the mountain made, something built, and someone will need to explain it." But explanations were the one thing he felt sure no one wanted. He had thought the drill hitting metal was a disaster for the schedule. Instead, it had dug up a secret that was never intended to return to daylight. And Michael, whether he wanted to be or not, had just become the first witness. When Michael finally stepped away from the opening and out of his harness, he felt like his boots weighed twice what they normally did. Dust and the smell of machinery clung to him, but beneath the physical exhaustion was something deeper, something crawling beneath his skin. He had seen things that shouldn't exist, and the weight of that knowledge made every sound around him feel too sharp. Workers whispered behind gloved hands, and though they didn't say his name, he felt their eyes follow him as if he had returned from somewhere forbidden. Supervisors immediately pulled him aside to barrage him with questions, but his answers only seemed to make them more uneasy. He told them about the smooth walls, the seamless corners, the dust that lay evenly as if time had simply pressed pause. He explained the ventilation port, the tracks on the floor, the perfectly engineered architecture. But as the words left his mouth, he watched the faces around him tighten with each detail, and he realized something unsettling. They weren't surprised. Shocked, perhaps, but not surprised. Someone, somewhere above them in rank, already knew there was something buried under this mountain. And that knowledge, hidden from everyone breaking their backs to carve through the rock, made every breath feel heavier. He barely slept that night. Even after the shift had ended and workers retreated to their trailers, trying to unwind with lukewarm dinners and mindless television, Michael remained restless. He kept replaying every moment underground, every reflection of his flashlight against metal that had no right to be there. His son's face flashed in his mind. Caleb's tired eyes and small, thin hands gripping his father's shirt when the world felt too scary. Michael had always promised he would protect him, but what if this discovery endangered not just him, but his family as well? The next morning brought orders from higher up. Activity would be suspended around the breach zone until a specialized team could arrive. That should have meant a day off for the workers, but instead the air was tense with the kind of fear that spread faster than rumors. Some muttered that they should never have drilled so deep. Others insisted the company knew more than they were letting on. Michael said nothing, but his silence only seemed to fuel their uncertainty. By midday, officials arrived in unmarked vehicles. They wore no identifiable insignia, just dark clothing, hard hats, and the kind of confidence that suggested authority. They reviewed Michael's camera footage, spoke quietly among themselves, and soon ordered that only select personnel would accompany them down into the structure for a controlled exploration. Michael's name was on that short list. He didn't know whether to feel honored or terrified. Descending again felt different. The dust seemed thicker, the air heavier. He tried to convince himself that his earlier dread had been nerves, but it had grown roots in his chest. The specialists, engineers, technicians, security personnel moved with the caution of people who understood the stakes. They traced light along every seam of the metal walls, recorded measurements, collected samples of the dust. At first, everything looked unchanged from the day before. Then they found the first room. The door looked identical to the others, perfectly flush, barely outlined in the metal wall. One of the engineers ran a handheld scanner along the panel and nodded to the others before using a compact cutting device to breach the seal. A hiss escaped, followed by a stale breeze that smelled faintly of plastic and cleaning solvents. When the door slid open, it revealed a series of narrow compartments, living quarters. Bunk beds lined either side of the room, 4 high at least, built with the same seamless precision as the walls. Each bed had thin blankets still perfectly tucked. Small shelves held the personal belongings: a comb, a book in a language Michael didn't recognize, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses folded neatly atop a notebook. The specialists exchanged discomforted glances but said little. Michael stepped forward, drawn by the eerie stillness of these rooms. He noticed a small framed photograph hanging beside one bunk, 2 young adults in white coats smiling proudly at a camera. A family member of someone who worked here? A reminder that these weren't ghosts or myths. People with ordinary lives had lived down here, hidden from the rest of the world. Farther in, he spotted a desk with its drawer open. Papers inside had yellowed but not crumbled, preserved by stable air and lack of moisture. He picked one up carefully. It was a form. Not a letter, not a report, but paperwork with sections labeled observational notes and subject responses. Subject? His tongue felt dry. He scanned the page until his eye caught a chilling phrase typed in a plainly clinical tone. Behavioral resistance escalating. Recommend isolation protocol. Someone had typed those words with institutional detachment, deciding fate with a keystroke. He carefully folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. A quiet act of rebellion, or an instinct for truth, he wasn't entirely sure which. Another room lay beyond, this one appearing to be an administrative area. Desks arranged in rows like a small command station, monitors mounted to walls, all powered down but intact. Filing cabinets sealed tight. His flashlight glinted off metal tags on equipment labeled only with numeric codes. No company logo, no military stamp. This was a place designed for secrecy, right down to the paperwork. On one desk, he found a pad of sticky notes with scribbled reminders. Check secondary airflow turbines. Unauthorized access audit. Ensure compliance log updated. Normal tasks in an abnormal burial ground. If letters or memos ever existed that could reveal who funded this place, they were removed long before the workers fled or vanished. And yet, there was a presence in the rooms that made Michael's skin tighten. Order, routine, purpose. None of this resembled a forgotten relic left behind for bureaucratic reasons. Life here had been structured, planned, controlled. Only something catastrophic could have made them abandon everything without warning. One of the specialists called out from farther down the corridor. They had discovered another living section, but this one was different. It held signs of personalization. Posters pinned above beds, books stacked unevenly, a chessboard frozen mid-game as if the players had been called away and intended to return. Michael picked up a sweatshirt draped over a chair. The fabric was brittle with time, but the scent of laundry powder remained faintly trapped in its fibers. He pictured a scientist slipping it on after a grueling shift, never imagining that moment would be their last here. He reached for another object on the shelf and brushed away dust to reveal a small keychain, a plastic spaceship with chipped paint, clearly more sentimental than functional. The room wasn't cold like the others. It felt lived in, loved even. So why had it all ended so abruptly? Where had the people gone? Their belongings remained. Their food remained. Their beds were unmade. But they were gone. As Michael moved deeper into the corridor, he noticed a slight incline leading downward, the floor sloping just enough to suggest a descent designed intentionally. He followed the specialists who had begun using portable sensors to check for gas leaks or radiation. Their tension rose with every red tick on their displays, though none showed anything overtly dangerous, only unusual. Beyond the final turn, Michael's breath caught. There, beneath a thicker layer of dust than the previous rooms, stood a row of lockers. Some were slightly ajar, and inside hung lab coats tagged with numbers instead of names. A photo strip taped inside one locker showed 3 smiling young researchers making funny faces. Moments of joy shared behind a secret they were sworn to protect. As Michael studied the scene, a realization struck him with sudden clarity. Each piece, every bed, every chair, every mundane tool, was frozen in time exactly as it had been left. No signs of struggle, no signs of evacuation protocol. It was as though someone had simply erased the people but left their world behind. A chill washed over him stronger than that metallic cold had earlier. The difference between a place abandoned and a place emptied was subtle, yet unmistakable. This was no ordinary disappearance. Something had cut life short here, not in chaos, but in silence. As he lifted his radio to report in, something scraped faintly behind him. He froze. The sound could have been machinery settling or a tool falling in the distance, but it could also have been something far worse. He turned slowly, expecting to see one of the specialists behind him, but what greeted him instead was more darkness. Too thick to see through, too absolute to be natural. Someone whispered his name through his radio. "Johnson, you still with us?" He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding and steadied his voice. "I'm here, still documenting." He needed to keep calm. Fear could twist shadows into phantoms. Yet, as he looked down the hallway, stretching into the unknown, a prickling sensation crawled over his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He tried to shake it off and return to the rooms where the others were still cataloging items. But the sensation persisted. The tightness in his chest lingered. The silence down here wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, as though the walls themselves were waiting for someone to ask the right question. This place wasn't merely a hidden facility. It was a story abruptly cut off, and Michael, with each step he took into its preserved halls of routine and dread, was no longer convinced it was entirely empty. The deeper they went, the more Michael felt the weight of the mountain press down on him, not only in the physical sense, but in a way that clawed through his nerves and into his thoughts. The upper floors of the complex resembled professional living quarters designed for skilled personnel, researchers, technicians, people who likely believed they were contributing to something significant. But as the sloping corridor descended into a second level, the atmosphere changed. The walls remained smooth and seamless, yet the hallway widened, and the lighting fixtures, though still dead, were arranged in softer, more comforting intervals. It felt designed not for professionals, but for someone more fragile. He noticed traces of color ahead, faint even under the dust. The meticulous monotony of gray metal had given way to splashes of faded blue and green, painted shapes that might have once been bright. He crouched, wiping away years of grime, and revealed the rough outline of a cloud. A bit further, a sun with triangular rays, children's drawings. The sight lodged in his throat like a swallowed stone. He straightened slowly, and the specialists behind him grew quiet as they, too, recognized the implications. They advanced collectively, driven not by orders now, but by morbid curiosity, and a dread that darkened with each step. Soon they reached the threshold of a large room. It was the first space in the building to show unmistakable evidence of a population the scientists upstairs should never have been near. Toys, plastic trucks, puzzle pieces, a stuffed rabbit missing one button eye, lay scattered on the floor. Crayon scribbles covered low display boards, depicting distorted houses and smiling figures with stick limbs and huge hands. The blankets, on a row of tiny beds, bore cartoon characters faded by time, but the arrangement of the beds, Their perfect alignment was militaristic. The blend of whimsy and institution created a dissonance that made Michael's stomach twist. He stepped inside carefully, the floor whispering under his boots. A doll lay face down at his feet. He picked it up gently, brushing away dust to reveal its painted eyes. They stared back at him with eerie vibrance, too innocent for the context. He set it down slowly, afraid that the room might shatter like glass if he disturbed it too much. His flashlight traced further, catching the corners of a chalkboard with words written in neat block letters. They weren't in English. They weren't in any language he identified immediately. But alongside the letters were numbers, scores, grades, evaluations, a child's evaluation. One of the specialists murmured something under their breath, but the words dissolved before reaching Michael fully. His attention was fixed on the desks, small ones with adjustable heights. Some still held papers, frozen in place mid-lesson. One sheet featured a shaky drawing of a mountain and a group of stick figures beneath it. Above the mountain loomed something vast and rectangular, drawn with bold, heavy strokes. It didn't resemble the sun or clouds. It resembled the facility itself, though the proportion and scale were distorted by a child's imagination. Michael's flashlight flickered slightly, and the shadows cast by the room's furniture lengthened, stretching like thin fingers. He stood very still until the light steadied. He cleared his throat, speaking as much to remind himself he was alive as to report to whoever might be listening. "It's a children's dormitory," he said into the radio. "Beds for maybe 20, 30, toys, learning materials, everything still here." Radio static answered him, a long hiss. Then the same controlled voice from earlier returned, faintly strained. "Copy that, Johnson. Document and proceed. We need a full behavioral context for the site. Continue exploring." Behavioral context. The phrase sounded rehearsed, clinical, as if they were expecting this. Michael moved toward another set of doors at the back of the dormitory. These doors were sturdier, equipped with the keycard access panels that still showed tiny darkened screens. Just beyond them, a sign mounted at eye level caught his attention. Its bold text was unmistakable even beneath grime. Observation Unit. An icy shiver crept up his spine. Observations of what? Or whom? The specialists gathered, preparing to force entry. The door resisted at first, clinging to its locked mechanisms as if determined to protect what lay beyond. Finally, with a sharp metallic groan, it slid open. A corridor unfurled before them, narrower yet lined with large windows to the right, windows into individual rooms. Michael approached the first pane cautiously, his breath fogging the glass for just a moment before he wiped it clear. Inside the small chamber was a bed with restraints, not chains, but soft straps, meant to hold struggling limbs gently yet firmly. A single chair sat beside the bed, positioned for watching. Walls were a pale shade of blue, intended to soothe, but the atmosphere, the emptiness, made the space feel like a trap. He forced himself to glance toward the next room. Identical setup, and the next, and the next. Children were housed here, not as guests or students, but as subjects. He couldn't avoid the word any longer. The form he had pocketed upstairs resurfaced in his memory, along with its chilling phrase, "behavioral resistance escalating." Suddenly, the sterile organization of this facility took on a different meaning. The neatness wasn't comfort, it was control. The silence wasn't peace, it was suppression. Michael swallowed hard as he pushed deeper, trying to reconcile what he saw with the world he thought he knew. The United States wasn't perfect. He knew that as a black man who had lived his life under shadowed systems, but even he struggled to accept the idea of children being hidden underground for behavioral studies. What kind of behavior could justify this level of secrecy? His flashlight traced the top of a cabinet where files lay. He brushed away dust and read the labels. Subject A014, Subject E006, Subject M002. No names. Only codes. Each folder contained charts, progress reports, and notes written in stiff scientific jargon. He skimmed one quickly, and his breath hitched when he reached the section marked Parent Status. 2 words repeated over and over. Unknown. Unavailable. Parents never knew where their children had gone. He clamped his jaw tightly to keep himself steady. For a moment, he imagined Caleb in one of these rooms, scared, alone, stripped of identity, turned into an object for someone's experiment. His chest constricted with a pain he couldn't swallow. He shoved the folder back into place with trembling fingers. At the end of the hall, the corridor broadened into yet another common space. Here, the walls were decorated with murals, clumsy but earnest, drawn by children's hands. A giraffe with blotchy spots, stick figure friends holding balloons, a rainbow arching overhead. The images were meant to bring joy. Now they twisted into something sadder, like laughter that had suffocated halfway out. A shelf along the right wall held tiny belongings in labeled bins, bracelets made of yarn and beads, crayon boxes with stickers peeling off, small sneakers lined neatly side by side, as though waiting for their owners to run outside. Each item had been placed with tenderness. Someone here had cared. Someone had tried to make life bearable. But care doesn't explain the restraints. Care doesn't justify disappearance. Michael's gaze drifted to a bulletin board pinned with brightly colored stars. Each star contained a number. Only a number. The simplicity of the display felt almost sinister. The specialists continued photographing, silently acknowledging what their cameras captured. One of them inhaled shakily. Michael was glad for the dim light. He wasn't ready to reveal the horror tightening his features. He moved into the next adjoining room, and the air shifted again, becoming noticeably colder. A faint hum reverberated here, too mechanical to be natural acoustics. This room held larger chairs, arranged in semicircles, facing mounted screens. Videos had once played to these captive children. Lessons or instructions or something worse. On a table lay puzzles and pattern cards. He picked one up. The edges remained crisp, unwarped by moisture or heat. Sealed in the dark, these artifacts had been preserved immaculately. As he examined the card, a sheet of lined paper slipped out from beneath it. A single sentence was written at the top in uneven handwriting. "When can I go home?" The words hit him harder than any falling rock ever had. He stood motionless, every sound in the room fading until only that desperate question echoed in his mind. The handwriting, young and hopeful, made tears well up unexpectedly. He blinked them away, unwilling to break in front of the others. Home. Did any of these children ever see theirs again? The specialists had moved on, guided by the relentless pursuit of evidence and answers. Michael followed, unable to tear himself from the weight of what he'd uncovered. He began photographing everything, not because he had been told to, but because some part of him feared destruction was coming. Something this damning would never be allowed into the light. Heavy steel doors waited at the back of the education hall, larger than before, reinforced with internal braces. Above them, a faded sign read, "Transfer Access." The security specialist stepped forward, working at the mechanism until the lock surrendered with a harsh, metallic sigh. Michael felt his pulse quicken as the doors slid apart. This chamber was different from all others. Sterile, circular, clinical in the most terrifying way. Gurneys lined up in rows, each with monitoring equipment attached. Cabinets sealed tight with hazard labels still clear. A console with switches and screens waited at the back. This room wasn't for teaching or sleeping. It was for procedures. He approached a metal tray on wheels, still positioned beside one of the gurneys. On it lay tools, needles, clamps, devices he didn't recognize. They were meticulously arranged, untouched by chaos. His stomach churned as he imagined children lying here scared and alone, staring up at bright, clinical lights. This was the reason the facility existed. This room was the heart of its purpose. And yet, there were no bodies, no blood, no clear sign of violence. That absence, he realized, was worse. Violence would have told a story. Silence erased one. He moved toward a cabinet labeled Authorized Access Only. It was locked, but beneath it lay a clipboard with records. He flipped through it slowly and saw the final entries. Dates, procedures, status updates. Then, abrupt conclusion. Each entry ended the same. Subject no longer present. Facility sealed per directive. A command carried out swiftly. The children weren't here when the complex was abandoned. They had been moved. Or they had been erased from the record in the simplest, coldest manner possible. Michael felt nauseous. A place built for children, underground, controlled, isolated, would never be allowed to exist in daylight. Whoever built this had worked outside any ethical boundary, and those capable of creating such a place would do anything to keep it hidden. He turned to leave, feeling the room closing in around him. With every step, the questions grew louder in his mind. Who authorized this? Why these children? Where were they taken? And the most frightening question of all, if someone had buried this facility beneath a mountain, what else were they willing to bury? He took one last long look at the rows of silent gurneys and whispered a promise beneath his breath, one he hoped didn't doom him. I will find out what they did to you. He didn't yet understand the danger in those words, but the walls did. The mountain did. And somewhere, someone who once watched those children from behind a one-way mirror would soon learn that their secret was no longer dead. Michael felt himself walking slower with every step he took away from the medical chamber. It wasn't fatigue. It was reluctance. The air that once felt stale now seemed to carry whispers of everything he had just seen. Every toy, every tiny bed, every chalk drawing pinned to walls had carved a weight in his chest that made movement feel like betrayal. Leaving that floor felt wrong, like turning his back on abandoned ghosts who desperately needed someone, anyone, to tell their story. The specialists ahead of him continued documenting with the cool professionalism expected in situations like this. To them, all of this was data, evidence, a problem to be analyzed and understood. To Michael, it was a nightmare that had been quietly locked beneath the earth and forgotten. He lingered, casting one last pained look at the room where children had been strapped down for procedures they never consented to. Then he forced himself forward. The hallway leading back upward seemed darker now, as if the complex itself resented the intrusion and wished to swallow them back into silence. When they emerged into the upper personnel level again, the contrast hit Michael unexpectedly. Adult existence lay here, beds where scientists had slept, desks where they had planned, mugs still sitting on tables. Not monsters, not demons. Humans had built this place and had carried out its work. The mundanity of evil was more horrifying than any fantasy his mind could muster. Near a cluster of administrative offices, a metal cabinet caught Michael's attention. It was set deeper into the wall than others, as though intentionally inconspicuous. He tried the handle. Locked. Something inside him hardened. He looked around, ensuring no one watched him closely, then used a tool from his belt to pry the thin seam open just enough to wedge his fingers in. Metal scraped harshly, and for a moment he feared someone would hear and stop him. But after a few tense seconds, the latch gave way with a subdued pop. Inside, folders lay stacked tightly, each marked only by short-coded references and dates. He slid one out and flipped it open. Names, finally names, filled the first page. He scanned the columns. Ages, birthdays, locations of disappearance. Most were listed as missing, presumed runaway. A few as legally relinquished. Several had notes. Removed without exposure. No external contact. Transfer to secure facility authorized. On the last page of the file, a red stamp was pressed over a list of final names. Program terminated. Assets nullified. He felt bile burn the back of his throat and a low growl rise in his chest. Assets? The children had been labeled assets. Dehumanized on paper so they could be handled like damaged equipment when things went wrong. His hands shook as he stuffed the file inside his jacket. He couldn't leave it. This was proof. Undeniable proof that children had been taken and hidden from the world. He dug deeper into the cabinet and found more documentation. Budget approvals blacked out with heavy ink, memos referencing a director and a division named only by initials, possibly part of a clandestine sector of government or a private contractor with too much power. He photographed as many pages as he could with his phone before the urge to keep searching for more dangerous truths pushed him further. In the back of the cabinet, behind a false panel, he discovered a small locked box. He pried it open with the same tool, careful but impatient. Inside lay a single notebook, handwritten, a diary. The penmanship was uneven, rushed in places, neat in others. He flipped to the first page. Dr. Evelyn Marrow, lead child psychologist. As he scanned entries at random, a horrifying picture emerged. She described children being removed from abusive homes because they were prime candidates. She wrote about their progress in compliance exercises and the variability in response to corrective influence. And then, near the end, her tone shifted into panic. It's not a relocation. They're not transferring them to another facility. The director's line. He said they were being sent back. But no one leaves this mountain. Not them. Not us. Something is coming, and the children know. I hear them crying at night. We are all trapped here. The ink stopped abruptly, the pen stroke trailing off the page. Michael closed the diary with trembling fingers. His heart hammered painfully. There were answers here, but they led to darker questions. Why had this place been sealed? Who gave the order to bury it alive under stone and secrecy? And what happened to everyone inside, children and adults alike? He backed away from the cabinet just as a specialist rounded the corner. Michael quickly shut the door as if nothing had been disturbed. The specialist gave him only a curt nod before continuing down the hall, but Michael saw something new in his expression now, a recognition of what this discovery meant. They all knew. Every step deeper into this place made it clearer. Someone would do anything to prevent this from coming to light. When they returned to the main level where Michael had first descended, a man in a dark jacket waited, arms folded, posture stiff. He wasn't part of the tunneling crew. He wasn't part of the engineering team. He radiated authority that made everyone straighten without a word of command. His gaze found Michael immediately. "You'll brief us, personally." His tone wasn't threatening, but it left no room for refusal. Michael nodded reluctantly and followed him to a makeshift briefing area where laptops and communication devices hummed quietly. He gave a basic report about what he saw: rooms, equipment, signs of abandonment, but he was careful. He left out the diary. He left out the files in his jacket. He left out the worst truths. Even with his omissions, the tension around the table thickened. One of the officials stepped aside to make a call, speaking in low, urgent tones. Another questioned him with a troubling lack of curiosity about the children. Only logistics, structural integrity, accessibility. Then the announcement came. Calm, cold, final. "All operations on this project are to cease immediately. Secure the area. Remove all non-essential personnel. Classified containment protocols are in effect." Workers were suddenly ordered to evacuation checkpoints. Heavy equipment was shut down. Temporary barriers were erected. No one was allowed near the breach anymore, not even to glance toward it. Men in unmarked uniforms guarded every approach within minutes. Michael returned to the crew area where his colleagues sat in silence, waiting for answers that wouldn't come. He felt their eyes on him again, searching for details he couldn't give. He placed his hand on his locker, fingers brushing the photo of his wife and son taped inside. Caleb's smile stared back at him, so small, so innocent. He thought of the children in the facility, denied families, denied sunlight, denied futures. What kind of monster would steal a child's life like that? His phone buzzed, a notification, automatic backup. The images he had taken were now stored in the cloud. He exhaled in relief, but then fear wrapped icy fingers around his neck. Backups could be traced, his actions could be discovered. Evidence could disappear if the wrong hands reached it first. He quickly forwarded the files to a contact he trusted, a journalist he knew from years past who never ignored a hint of corruption. The message he attached was simple. "If something happens to me, don't let this die." Pressing send felt like crossing a point of no return. Night fell with unsettling speed. The facility had been sealed off, but the unease remained, thicker than the darkness around the construction base. Workers tried to distract themselves with jokes and card games, but their laughter rang hollow. Everyone sensed that they had unearthed something they never should have found. Michael returned to his trailer, exhaustion weighing down every muscle. He locked the door behind him and collapsed into the small chair at his foldable table. The silence was loud, filled with adrenaline still echoing through his skull. He pulled the diary from his jacket and placed it on the table, staring at the cover as though it might suddenly explain everything. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to think this nightmare might eventually resolve, that someone would take responsibility, fix what had been broken, bring justice to the stolen children. A knock shattered that hope instantly. Not a polite knock, a measured one. A knock that expected obedience, not invitation. Every nerve in his body went rigid. They had come. Not tomorrow. Not after the official reports. Tonight. His blood turned cold as the knocking continued. Michael inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stand. He understood then. By choosing truth, he had put himself directly in the crosshairs of the same people who once filled those underground rooms with children and lies. The knocking didn't stop. It came again. 3 sharp raps against the thin metal door of the trailer. Each one cut through the quiet like the swing of an axe, threatening to split his world in two. Michael stood frozen in the center of the room, pulse pounding against his ribs so fiercely he wondered if the men outside could hear it. He tried to swallow, but his throat was so tight that the attempt felt like choking. Those knocks weren't from supervisors or coworkers. This wasn't a welfare check. These were the kind of knocks that promised consequences rather than conversation. He forced himself to move, one slow step at a time. Each quiet footfall seemed too loud in the cramped silence of the trailer. The diary on the table seemed to stare up at him like a live accusation. Every instinct screamed to hide it, to hide the copies he'd made, to erase everything and pretend he had never discovered the truth buried under the mountain. But some part of him, the same part that had always insisted on carrying more than his share of weight, kept him from collapsing into fear. When he finally reached the door, his hand hovered over the latch. He considered not opening it. Maybe they would assume he was asleep. Maybe they would leave. The next knock didn't wait politely. It slammed into the door with impatience. He opened it. Two men stood outside dressed not in military fatigues, but in plain clothes that were somehow more threatening. Hard eyes, clean-shaven, broad shoulders filling out the silhouettes they deliberately kept unremarkable. They didn't wear identification or badges, but their presence was unmistakable. Power granted from a place where accountability did not reach. "Mr. Johnson," the taller one said, a greeting without warmth. The shorter one scanned the interior of the trailer over Michael's shoulder as though expecting to see someone else inside. Michael gripped the edge of the door, knuckles whitening. "It's late," he muttered, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "And I'm off shift. We need to discuss the situation below the mountain," the tall one replied, ignoring the attempt at formality. "May we come inside?" It wasn't a question. Michael stepped aside because resistance wasn't an option yet. They entered without haste, without hesitation, and Michael closed the door behind them, not because they asked, but because leaving it open suddenly felt like an invitation to danger from both directions. The shorter man positioned himself near the window, blocking the only other exit. The taller took 2 steps into the center of the room and turned to face Michael with an expression carved out of cold stone. "You discovered something today," the tall man began. "Something that is now classified at the highest level. It is not information you are permitted to retain." Michael's spine stiffened, and the urge to glance toward the table, toward the diary, was almost impossible to resist. He forced himself to stare only at their faces, keeping his breathing steady. "I told your team everything I saw," he replied carefully. "You have the reports." "Yes," the man said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We have the reports. But you left out parts of your story." That sentence hit harder than any punch. Michael felt heat surge beneath his skin. "I gave the full assessment," he insisted, hoping lies didn't sound as hollow as they felt in his mouth. The shorter man spoke for the first time. "You took items from the facility." Michael's heartbeat stumbled. Had someone seen him slip the papers into his jacket? Had a camera still been active somewhere? Or did they simply know to assume the worst from the man who had found the truth? "We'd like them back," the taller man said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Michael considered denial, but these men weren't guessing. They were stating facts. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, even though fear coiled tight inside him like barbed wire. The man's eyelids lowered slightly, almost pitying. "We're not here to make your life difficult, Mr. Johnson. On the contrary, we're here to help." He reached into his jacket pocket. Michael tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, the man withdrew a slim envelope and placed it calmly on the table next to the diary. Michael stared at it. "For your son," the man said softly. We understand his medical care is expensive. This is merely the beginning. We can ensure he receives what he needs. No waiting lists, no insurance battles, a better quality of life." Each word slithered into Michael's fear like poison coated in mercy. The price lingered unspoken, but obvious. "And what do I give you in return?" Michael asked, though he already knew. "Your silence," the taller man replied, his voice almost gentle now. "No conversations with coworkers, no messages to outside parties, no retained evidence. You simply forget what you saw. It never existed, just like the facility never existed, just like those children." He paused long enough to let the thought sink in. Never existed. Michael's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. Anger threatened to spill from him like boiling liquid. But woven through that fury was terror. They knew about Caleb. They knew about his family. They knew enough to destroy everything he loved, not just him. The shorter man finally moved away from the window. With unhurried steps, he approached Michael directly. There was no violence in his posture, just the quiet confidence of someone who had ruined many men before. "You don't have to be a hero," he said quietly. "Being a father is enough." The room tilted a little. Michael's vision wavered. The choice being forced upon him was a blade with two sharpened edges. Either way, he bled. If he cooperated, he would be complicit in silencing atrocities committed against children. He would betray their memory for the sake of saving his own family. If he resisted, Caleb could suffer. Sandra could suffer. Their lives were in the hands of men like these. No good choice, only survival. "I want to speak to my wife," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "This concerns her too." "Of course," the tall man replied, though the way he said it made it clear that what Sandra thought or wanted was irrelevant. "But first, the materials you took." Michael's hand drifted slightly, almost unconsciously, toward the table. Toward the diary. He forced himself to stop. He lifted his gaze slowly, and when he met the tall man's eyes again, he saw there was no malice there. That somehow made it even more horrific. He stepped back, turned away, forced his voice to remain level. "I don't have anything." The man sighed, not out of frustration but disappointment, as though a student had given the wrong answer to a question he had been warned was on the test. "You're making this unnecessarily complicated," he murmured. "We assumed a man in your position would choose wisely." The shorter one finally spoke again. "Where is the diary, Michael?" Hearing his name said in such a quiet, practiced tone made his skin crawl. He thought of Caleb's tired smile. He thought of the tiny hand that squeezed his when fear became too much. He thought of those forgotten children who didn't get the chance to hold on to anyone at all. His chest hurt. Every breath felt wrong. "You should leave," Michael whispered. Both men stood still, exchanging a brief glance. Then the tall one nodded once, and the shorter stepped toward the door. Before following him out, the tall one paused and placed a business card on the table beside the envelope. No logo, only a phone number. "Consider what you're risking," he said. "Your son has a chance at life if you let this go. We'll return tomorrow for your decision." He let the door close behind him without waiting for a reply. The moment they were gone, Michael collapsed into the chair, air finally leaving his lungs like a punctured container. He pressed his palms against his face and let out a sound halfway between a sob and a growl. The envelope lay beside the diary, hope and horror side by side. He stared at the envelope for a long time. Then he grabbed it and tore it open with shaking fingers. Inside, stacks of crisp bills fanned out like mocking wings. More money than he had seen in years. Enough for hospital visits, enough for medicine, enough for a little safety, enough to betray everyone taken under that mountain. He slammed the envelope shut and shoved it away as if it burned him. The diary sat there, small and fragile but pulsing with truth. He opened it again to the final entry, the unfinished sentence full of fear. He imagined Dr. Evelyn Marrow writing desperately in those final hours as something sealed their fate. She had tried to leave a record, to leave a voice behind. Michael couldn't become another silent witness. His phone buzzed again, a message from the journalist he had contacted earlier. Just one word, received. That tiny confirmation steadied him. Barely, but enough. Enough to breathe again. Enough to think. He needed to protect his family. But truth couldn't stay buried. Not this truth. He picked up the diary, holding it like a fragile life in his hands, then crossed the room to a hidden compartment in the trailer floor. One he had built years ago for tools no one needed to know about. He placed the diary inside, covering it with a battered blanket and 3 rusted wrenches. Tomorrow they would want silence. They would want compliance. But tonight he allowed himself one promise in the dark, a vow as heavy as the mountain above them. I won't let them erase you. Whether that vow would save him or destroy him remained unknown. But he had crossed a line now, one those men would not let him step back from. Outside the thin walls of his trailer, the footsteps of unseen watchers lingered long after the last shadow passed. Sleep never came. Michael spent the long hours of the night sitting by the window, staring into the darkness outside his trailer where the shadows stretched unnaturally still. Every creak of metal, every faint whisper of wind against the siding made his muscles tense as if waiting for fists to break through the glass. His heart never settled into a steady rhythm. It remained trapped in the frantic pace of prey that knows a predator is near but cannot yet see its eyes. When dawn finally crept over the mountains, pale and diluted, he felt no relief. The sunlight only revealed how eerily quiet the construction site had become. Heavy equipment sat frozen where it had been shut down the day before. Yellow caution tape wrapped around the breached drilling zone fluttered like a warning flag in a war zone. Workers gathered in anxious clusters, whispering among themselves, trying to understand why their livelihoods had been halted without explanation. They glanced at him with looks that were both curious and frightened. Somehow, everyone seemed to sense he was connected to whatever darkness lay beneath the ground they had opened. Maybe it was the way the officials had demanded to speak only with him. Maybe news traveled faster among frightened men. But no one approached him for answers. They kept their distance, as though standing too close might make them guilty too. Michael forced himself to move through the motions. He ate nothing. He packed slowly, pretending he believed that this day might end peacefully. The envelope of cash remained hidden in a drawer. The business card with the unmarked number burned invisible holes in his jacket pocket. He avoided the temptation to crush it in his fist. There would be a time for choosing, but it wasn't now. Not while eyes watched from every corner. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife, short and filled with casual concern. How's work? Everything okay? He stared at the words, wishing he could answer honestly. Wishing he could reach through the screen, take her and Caleb and run far from this cursed mountain before anyone could even notice they'd gone. But that was a fantasy. The kind of fantasy reserved for people not hunted by those who erased children from the earth. He typed a simple reply. Long day yesterday. I'll explain tonight. Love you both. He slid the phone into his pocket and stepped outside, feeling the cool air tighten around him like a vice. He needed to think. He needed to understand what his next move should be. The journalist had received the files he'd sent, but there was no telling how long it would take to verify them, no telling whether she'd already been silenced. He didn't dare contact her again. Not yet. The men in the trailer last night had made it clear they were listening, watching. He walked toward the mess tent, seeking coffee if nothing else, but stopped abruptly when he saw two workers he had descended with the day before standing by a dumpster. They weren't talking, just staring inside with horrified disbelief. Michael approached cautiously. "What's going on?" he asked. One of them slowly pointed into the dumpster. Michael stepped closer and froze. Inside, piled beneath a thin layer of trash bags, were pieces of clothing he recognized from the complex below. Children's sweaters, small shirts, socks with the cartoon characters. They had been stripped from the rooms, discarded as waste. His mouth went dry. Whoever was securing the site wasn't just sealing off evidence, they were destroying it. Erasing every trace of the children, piece by fragile piece. The worker nearest him shook his head. "This ain't right, Mike. They're throwing away stuff like it's garbage. Toys, too. Whole bins of them." Michael's voice was thin when he asked, "Where did this come from?" The man shrugged helplessly. "Some guys in black loaded it up. They said it's contaminated material. That's a lie, isn't it?" Michael couldn't answer. He turned away before his expression betrayed too much. Fury pulsed under his skin so hot it felt like a fever. Someone wanted the world to forget. Someone believed they could bury history under layers of deceit again. Not if he could stop them. As he walked away, he felt the weight of a pair of eyes settle on him. He turned to see the tall man from last night, standing alone near the security barricade, watching him, waiting. There was no threat in his posture, but there was a promise that choices had consequences. Michael wasn't sure whether to approach him or flee, but flight wasn't an option, not while the truth was being packed into dumpsters and burned. He forced himself to walk toward the man, head held high, hands steady even as his insides spiraled in panic. The tall man spoke without preamble. "Have you made a decision?" Michael glanced around briefly to ensure no one else stood close enough to overhear. "I'll give you what you want," he said carefully. The tall man smiled without warmth. "You're doing the right thing." Michael's voice dropped to a slow murmur. "But my family gets protection, access to treatment, a guarantee." "The guarantee," the man replied, "comes with compliance." Michael nodded, just enough movement to pass as agreement. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. He was walking a razor's edge, and he knew one slip could cut him so deep he'd never recover. "When?" Michael asked. "Tonight," the man responded. "We'll handle everything. A fresh start for you. Just be ready." Michael nodded again and stepped back. The man's gaze lingered for a moment before he turned and joined two other suited figures heading down to the secured zone. Michael exhaled shakily. He had bought himself hours to plan, hours to act. But what action could possibly succeed against a force capable of disappearing entire human lives? He returned to his trailer and locked the door behind him. He grabbed the diary again and flipped through its pages more carefully this time. Near the back, tucked between the pages of the final entries, he discovered something he had missed before: a folded evacuation plan. It mapped layouts beyond the levels they had explored. There was a sub-basement. a fifth tier beneath the children's dormitory, labeled in stark capital letters, "Unauthorized Access." It was where the gurneys had led, where final procedures had taken place, where the ultimate truth likely remained. He realized abruptly that what he saw, those empty rooms, might not have been the full story. Maybe the bodies hadn't been taken somewhere else. Maybe they were deeper, far deeper, sealed behind steel thicker than anything above. The thought made his hands go numb. If he could reach that level, document it, expose what truly happened, then silence would be impossible, even for them. He checked the time. The site was crawling with authority and armed presence now, but there would be a shift change in a few hours. That would be his moment. He needed to find a way back inside the complex. He needed more evidence. The world wouldn't believe him without it. He packed a small tool bag, flashlight, multi-tool, rope, spare battery, and strapped it across his shoulder. Each item felt like a pebble in a slingshot aimed at a giant. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a father who refused to let lost children disappear twice. As he opened the floor compartment again, his fingers brushed the cold spine of the diary. He hesitated before closing the lid, wishing he could take it with him for protection or comfort. But it was safer hidden here than anywhere near the facility. Twilight cast long shadows by the time he slipped from the trailer, moving quietly between equipment and vehicles toward the breach zone. Guards stood stationed at every visible entrance, but Michael knew tunnels better than they did. He had spent most of his life underground. He could find cracks in stone where no one else thought to look. He found a maintenance shaft partially collapsed from earlier drilling vibration. It was narrow, treacherous, and easily overlooked. He tested its stability before sliding in, the rock scraping against his jacket and skin. He descended into the darkness he had promised himself never to enter again. Yet here he was, choosing descent. Every breath echoed like a secret trying to escape. When he reached the lower level, the air again felt unnatural, too still, too expectant. His flashlight cut through the darkness and revealed the familiar smooth metallic surfaces waiting like a forgotten machine wakened from sleep. He listened. No alarms, no footsteps, just a silence that had teeth. He retraced his earlier exploration, past the bunk room, the labs, the children's dormitory. Each space felt heavier, as if time itself resented being disrupted. The stairs leading downward awaited him like the open jaws of the unknown. He gripped the railing and began his slow descent to the sub-basement. Halfway down, the faintest sound echoed upward. A metallic click, followed by another. Footsteps. Someone else was down here. Michael stopped breathing. Heart pounding, he slid into the shadow behind a column. His flashlight switched off, leaving him in thick blackness. The footsteps drew closer, measured, deliberate. He strained to see any sign, movement, a silhouette, a reflection. Nothing. Then a voice, low, male, not speaking to him but into a radio. Yes, he entered through the west shaft. He's here. Michael's blood ran cold. They had been waiting for him. He wanted to run, wanted to retreat back into the shaft, clawing up through stone until the sunlight blinded him. But footsteps began to close off the path behind him as well. He was cornered, trapped between two advancing forces. His only escape was forward, toward the fifth tier, toward the truth, toward danger so absolute that fear didn't even have time to grow claws. He bolted, down the remaining stairs, into a hall where temperature plunged sharply, condensing his breath into visible clouds. Alarms finally responded to motion, flashing red strobes that bathed the hall in pulses of panic. At the end of the corridor loomed the final door, reinforced, larger than the others. The lock mechanism was thick and complicated, designed to keep something in, not keep intruders out. Shouting voices echoed behind him. Michael hurled his entire weight at the panel. It didn't budge. He tried his tool, prying at vulnerable creases, sparks spitting against his gloves. Behind him, boots slammed down the stairs like approaching thunder. He jammed the tool into the last seam and pulled with a strength born not from muscle, but from desperation. The door screeched open just enough for him to slip through. Then it slammed shut behind him as a gunshot ricocheted off the metal. Panting, trembling, Michael turned his flashlight toward the center of the chamber. What he saw there froze him more completely than any barrel of a gun ever could. Children. Rows of small metal capsules, cryogenic containers, each with a tiny window, frosted. Inside them, shapes. Small, motionless shapes. Somewhere in the distance behind him, fists pounded the door, shouting threats or warnings, he couldn't tell. They were muffled beneath his horror. His light landed on one window where the frost had thinned slightly. A face, pale, still, eyes closed as if sleeping. Not gone, not buried, kept. Every cell in his body shook with rage and grief. They had not erased these children. They had stored them, preserved them, waiting. For what? He stumbled forward and pressed his palm against the cold capsule. "I'm here," he whispered, voice breaking. "I see you." The pounding at the door intensified. Metal groaned. They would break through any moment. Michael faced the children again, and he felt the magnitude of what he now carried. Not a burden, a duty. He might not live long enough to expose this secret, but someone would. The journalist had the files. Sandra would know where to look if he didn't return. And truth, once awakened, could not be forced back into silence. The door behind him screamed under force. Michael stood his ground. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. Not while stolen children were trapped in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to remember they existed. If you think this story deserves to be heard, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. Watch our other shocking stories right now. You won't believe what was uncovered in those cases. And share this video with others, because the truth doesn't stay buried when we spread it together.